It is 40,000 years ago. You want to get married. There is no courthouse, no priest, no signature, no written language. And yet somehow everyone in your group knows exactly who is promised to whom, what was exchanged, who owes what, and what happens if someone breaks the deal. So here is the question. How do you make a marriage contract before contracts technically exist? Because when we hear the phrase marriage contract today, we imagine paper legal language, two signatures, maybe a witness, maybe a lawyer sitting across the table with the emotional warmth of a filing cabinet. But for most of human history, none of that existed. No one could write down the vows. No one could write down the payment. No one could file a copy with the local government because there was no local government and also no filing cabinet. And also the concept of paperwork had not yet arrived to ruin everyone's afternoon. And yet marriage, or something very much like marriage, existed. People formed long-term pair bonds. Families negotiated who joined whom. Children mattered. Inheritance mattered. Labor mattered. Alliances mattered. Jealousy definitely mattered because that one appears to be extremely old and deeply committed to the project. So before writing, before law codes, before wedding certificates, ancient humans still had to solve the same basic problem. How do you turn a private relationship into a public obligation? And the answer is one of the oldest pieces of social technology humans ever invented. Witnesses, not paper. People. The first thing we need to understand is that marriage was almost never just about two people being in love. That sounds cynical, but it is not. Love may be ancient. Attachment is ancient. Desire is ancient. The human need to look at one specific person across the fire and think, oh no, this one matters, is probably very, very old. But marriage as a social institution is bigger than feeling. Marriage is about creating a recognized bond between groups, not just two bodies, two kin networks, two camps, two lineages. Sometimes two villages, sometimes two groups that would very much prefer not to stab each other over access to water, grazing land, trade routes, or an insult from 3 winters ago that absolutely no one has forgotten. Marriage turns intimacy into diplomacy. That is the part modern romance tends to hide under flowers and music, and people pretending they are not stressed about seating arrangements. In small-scale societies, your choice of partner affected everyone around you. Who would help raise the children? Who had rights over those children? Which group gained labor? Which group lost labor? Who owed gifts? Who had obligations during famine? Who could call on whom during conflict? Who was allowed to visit, hunt, gather, trade, or sleep near which fire? This was not casual. A marriage could be a peace treaty with a bed in the middle of it. And once you see that, the contract part starts to make sense. Because a contract is just a remembered obligation. Writing is one way to remember, but it is not the only way. For most of human history, the document was the community. If two families agreed that a young man would marry a young woman, or that two people would join households, or that one person would move to another group, the agreement did not become real because someone scratched marks onto a tablet. It became real because everyone important saw it happen. The parents saw it, the siblings saw it, the elders saw it, the cousins saw it, the people who gossip professionally, which in a small society is basically everyone saw it. That matters because in a world without writing, memory was not casual. Memory was infrastructure. We modern people are terrible at understanding this because we outsource memory to objects. Calendars remember for us. Phones remember for us. Banks remember for us. Governments remember for us. Your email inbox remembers things you desperately wish it would forget, but oral societies had to train memory differently. People remembered genealogies. They remembered debts. They remembered who gave what to whom, who insulted whom, who was owed compensation, who had married into which family, and whose grandmother had once made an agreement that was still somehow causing problems. This was not primitive. This was administrative genius without stationery. And marriage contracts lived inside that system. Let's start with the most obvious part, the ceremony. A wedding ceremony at its core is not just a party. It is a public memory device. That is why people gather. That is why there are witnesses. That is why vows are spoken out loud. That is why families stand in specific places. That is why objects are exchanged. That is why food is served. That is why everyone dresses differently and behaves strangely and cries at moments that would seem completely confusing if you were just observing the species from a distance. The ceremony makes the agreement impossible to miss. It burns the event into group memory. Before writing, that was the point. If two people simply wandered into the woods and decided privately that they were married now, that might matter emotionally, but socially it created a problem. Who knows? Who agrees? Who recognizes the children? Who owes help? Who has rights? Who has responsibilities? What happens if one person leaves? Without witnesses, the answer is chaos. With witnesses, the answer is pressure. And pressure is law before law becomes law. In many traditional societies, marriage was established through a sequence of public acts: negotiation, gift exchange, feasting, blessings, transfer of goods, movement of the bride or groom to a new household, public acknowledgement by elders, sometimes ritual touching, hand clasping, shared food, shared drink, shared fire. None of those things are random. They are proof, not proof for a court, proof for a memory. Think about bridewealth because it is one of the most widespread marriage systems in human history and also one of the most misunderstood. Bridewealth does not mean every society treated women exactly the same way, and it definitely does not mean every ancient marriage was fair or romantic or kind. Some systems were deeply unequal. Some were coercive. Some treated women far too much like transferable property, because humans as a species have always been capable of building beautiful rituals around extremely uncomfortable power structures. But bridewealth itself is more complicated than buying a wife. In many societies, bridewealth was a transfer of value from the groom's family to the bride's family. Cattle, shells, metal, cloth, tools, food, labor, or other valuables. And that transfer did several things at once. It showed commitment. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. It created an alliance between two groups. It gave the bride's family leverage. It made the marriage public. And most importantly, it created a debt trail that everyone could remember. If your family gave my family 10 cattle, or 40 shell beads, or a season of labor, or a feast large enough to make everyone mildly regret being alive, the next morning, people remembered that, they talked about it, they repeated it, they exaggerated it, they used it later during arguments. In other words, it worked exactly like family still works. The exchange was the receipt, and because the exchange happened publicly, it became very hard to deny. You could not simply say, "No, I never agreed to this marriage," when half the village had watched your uncle hand over 3 extremely valuable objects while everyone ate and sang and your mother gave a speech that was mostly blessing and partly threat. Public exchange made the promise durable. There were also dowry systems, where wealth moved with the bride into the new household, often from her family. Dowry could serve different purposes depending on the society. Sometimes it helped establish the new household, sometimes it represented inheritance, sometimes it protected the woman economically, sometimes it did the opposite and made her vulnerable to exploitation. Again, humans are complicated, and any system powerful enough to organize families is also powerful enough to be abused. But the logic is the same. Marriage was not just spoken, it was materialized. The promise became objects: food, labor, land rights, jewelry, livestock, textiles, tools. A contract you can hold in your hands is easier to remember, and in a world without writing, objects spoke. A ring still does this. That is the funny thing. A wedding ring is not legally necessary in many modern places. The state does not usually care whether you have a tiny shiny circle on your finger. But people care because the ring is portable public evidence. It says, this relationship is recognized. This promise has a social boundary around it. Something happened and people are supposed to know. That is ancient logic. A ring is a little wearable witness. Now, not every marriage system involved goods. Some involved service. In what anthropologists often call bride service, a man might work for the family of the woman he wanted to marry. He might hunt, farm, herd, build, provide food, or prove reliability over time. This makes a certain brutal sense. If you are a parent in a small-scale society and someone wants to marry into your family, you may not care about his poetry. You may care whether he can actually contribute. Can he work? Can he show up? Can he keep promises? Does he vanish whenever things get hard? Does he treat people well when nobody powerful is watching? Bride service turns character into evidence, not perfect evidence. People can fake character for a while. Anyone who has ever dated anyone knows this, but long-term service is harder to fake than a speech. It lets the family observe the future spouse under pressure. It transforms the marriage negotiation into a trial period, which is basically ancient humanity inventing the internship, but with higher stakes and fewer online forms. And again, everyone knows everyone sees the labor. Everyone sees whether the promise is being honored. The public nature is the contract. This is the key. Before writing, agreements were enforced through relationships. Reputation was everything. In a tiny community, reputation is not a personal brand. It is survival. If you break a promise in a modern city, you might move apartments, change jobs, block someone, and reinvent yourself as a person who is suddenly very into hiking. In a small oral society, good luck. Everyone knows. Your mother knows. Their mother knows. The elder who never says much but remembers absolutely everything knows. The children know, and the children will turn it into a song because children are merciless and history has always known this. Reputation followed you because there was nowhere for it to go. That made promises powerful. If a groom's family failed to deliver bride wealth, people remembered. If a bride's family violated an agreement, people remembered. If someone abandoned a spouse without cause, people remembered. If a family repeatedly broke marriage promises, other families would stop trusting them. And in a world where survival depended on trust, that was not a minor inconvenience. That was social damage. This is how law works before law is written down. Not through police, not through courts, not through forms. Through memory, shame, reciprocity, and the threat of exclusion. Which sounds harsh, and often was, but it also worked because humans are intensely social animals. We are built to care what the group thinks, not because we are shallow, but because for most of our history, being rejected by the group could get you killed. Public opinion was not just noise, it was an enforcement mechanism. There is another piece people miss. Oral agreements were often embedded in ritual because ritual makes memory sticky. If I tell you, 2 families agreed to a marriage, you might forget. If I tell you, they stood before the elders at sunset, exchanged carved shell bracelets, shared a bowl of fermented drink, burned herbs in the fire, and the grandmother of the bride recited the names of 7 ancestors while everyone watched, you remember that. Ritual is memory with lighting. It takes an agreement and makes it emotionally charged. That matters because humans remember emotion better than plain information. We remember embarrassment. We remember fear. We remember awe. We remember being watched. We remember singing together. We remember food. We remember strange clothes. We remember symbolic objects. A marriage ceremony uses all of that. It makes the contract unforgettable by making it beautiful, intense, awkward, expensive, public, and slightly exhausting, which, if you have ever attended a wedding, still checks out. The ancient ceremony was not extra decoration placed on top of the contract. The ceremony was the contract. The spoken vow was not just romantic language. It was testimony. The feast was not just celebration. It was proof that resources had been committed. The witnesses were not just guests. They were the living archive. And this is why writing did not invent marriage contracts. Writing arrived late. Very late. Humans have existed in something like our current form for hundreds of thousands of years. Writing appears only around 5,000 years ago, first in early complex societies like Mesopotamia and Egypt. And even then, most people could not read or write. So if marriage contracts required writing, then almost all human marriages before the Bronze Age would have been contractless confusion. By the time people started writing marriage agreements down, they were usually recording systems that already existed. Writing did not create the obligation. It captured it, it turned oral memory into external memory. That is a big shift, but it is not the beginning. In early written societies, marriage contracts could specify payments, property rights, inheritance, obligations, penalties for divorce, and the status of children. That is fascinating, but it is also a clue. Because written law tends to formalize what people have already been fighting about for generations. You do not create rules about bride wealth unless people are already arguing about bride wealth. You do not create rules about divorce payments unless divorce has already made everyone furious. You do not write down inheritance rules unless property, children, and family lines have already become complicated enough to require backup. Writing is often what happens when memory alone is no longer enough. When societies get larger, strangers interact more often, wealth becomes more complex, and people can no longer rely entirely on everyone knowing everyone else. You need records, but in smaller groups the record was social. Your grandmother's memory was a legal document with opinions. This is also why kinship mattered so much. A marriage contract without writing was rarely just between individuals. It was between kin groups. If one person failed, their relatives were still implicated. If a husband mistreated a wife, her family might intervene. If a wife left, her kin group might need to return gifts, negotiate compensation, or defend her reasons. If children were born, both families could have claims, responsibilities, and expectations. This could protect people. It could also trap people. We have to be honest about that. Ancient marriage systems were not automatically wholesome because they were ancient. A public contract can defend someone, but it can also control them. Family authority can provide safety, but it can also crush individual choice. Ritual can create belonging, but it can also make refusal almost impossible. The past was not a simple moral lesson. It was humans. Meaning impressive, tender, practical, unfair, brilliant, and occasionally horrifying all at once. But what is extraordinary is the sophistication. People without writing were not just wandering around hoping everyone remembered who married whom. They built systems, they used witnesses, they used exchange, they used ritual, they used kinship, they used reputation. They used repeated formulaic speech, songs, genealogies, public blessings, curses, feasts, gifts, and social pressure. They made promises visible. That is what a contract has always tried to do. Make an invisible agreement visible enough that other people can enforce it. And once you understand that, modern marriage starts to look very different. Why do weddings have witnesses? Because the witness is older than the document. Why do vows happen out loud? Because speech used to be the binding act. Why does family approval still matter in so many cultures? Even when the law says two adults can decide for themselves. Because marriage spent most of human history as a family alliance, not a private lifestyle choice. Why are gifts exchanged? Because material exchange has always been one of the ways humans make promises real. Why do people throw expensive ceremonies when they could technically just sign papers? Because deep down, we still understand that a major life transition feels incomplete unless the community sees it. We still want the promise to be witnessed. The paperwork may satisfy the state, but the ceremony satisfies something older. Something in the human mind wants the group to gather and say, yes, we saw this. Yes, this happened. Yes, these two people now stand in a different relationship to each other and to us. That is ancient, older than writing, older than law, probably older than agriculture. And maybe that is the most interesting part. Marriage contracts did not begin as cold legal documents. They began as remembered promises surrounded by people. Before there were signatures, there were hands clasped in front of witnesses. Before there were legal records, there were elders who remembered. Before there were courthouse archives, there were families telling the story again and again until it became part of the group's history. Before there was paper, there was reputation. Before there was ink, there was consequence. So how did ancient humans negotiate marriage contracts without written language? They made the agreement impossible to forget. They negotiated in public. They exchanged things that mattered. They gathered witnesses. They wrapped the promise in ritual. They tied two families together so tightly that breaking the agreement would not just hurt two people. It would disturb the whole social web around them. And that web was the contract. The honest answer is we do not know exactly how the earliest humans did this, because speech vanishes. Ceremonies vanish, promises vanish. The first marriage negotiation did not fossilize politely for archaeologists, but the pattern is clear from anthropology, from early law codes, from oral societies, from the stubborn survival of wedding customs all over the world. The tools changed, the core mechanism did not. A promise becomes more powerful when other people hear it. A bond becomes more stable when families recognize it. An agreement becomes harder to break when it lives in the memory of the group. That is why the witness may be one of the oldest legal technologies humans ever invented. Not the ring, not the document, not the priest. The witness, the person who can say, I was there, and there is something strangely beautiful about that. Because for all the machinery we have built around marriage now, the licenses, the laws, the contracts, the tax forms, the seating charts, the group chats, the photographer asking everyone to stand slightly closer together, even though everyone is already deeply uncomfortable, the center of it is still ancient. Two people stand in front of others and make a promise. Other people watch, other people remember. And somehow, across tens of thousands of years, that is still how humans make private love into public reality. So next time you see a wedding, or attend one, or get trapped in a conversation about centerpieces with someone who has developed extremely strong opinions about napkin colors, remember this. Underneath all of that modern noise is something very old, a group of humans gathering to witness a bond, a promise being turned into memory, a contract written first not on paper, but in the minds of everyone standing around the fire. So here is my question for you. If you had to make a marriage contract with no paper, no signature, and no law, who would you trust to remember it? Let me know in the comments. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.